is a 2002 Mercedes-Benz ML55 AMG, and it may not look like much, but it was the beginning of a whole new genre of cars, the fast luxury SUV. The Porsche Cayenne, the Audi RSQ8, the BMW X5 M, the Lamborghini Urus, the Ferrari Purosangue, they all owe something to this old-school Mercedes-Benz. Today, I'm going to review this ML55 AMG and explain, and I'll show you all of its quirks and features. Before I get started, big news, this ML55 AMG is currently for sale and it's being auctioned live on Cars and Bids. This has been in California its whole life, it's unmodified, and it's offered with no reserve. So, once you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below to visit the live auction for this ML55 where you can bid on it and buy it only on Cars and Bids. Alright, time for the quirks and features of the ML55 AMG, starting with a little background. The original Mercedes-Benz ML was itself a pioneering luxury SUV when it came out for the 1998 model year. Prior to the original ML320, other luxury SUVs before that had either been serious off-roaders like the Range Rover and the Land Rover Discovery, or sort of upgraded versions of existing SUVs like the Acura SLX and the Oldsmobile Bravada. The 98 ML320 was the first real luxury SUV like we know it today, sort of a ground-up luxury vehicle aimed at suburban on-road drivers who wanted a nicer family car experience, and it was a big deal. And Mercedes continued to pioneer, beginning in 2000 with the arrival of this, the ML55, which really was the first performance luxury SUV like we know it today. The ML55 came out before the Porsche Cayenne Turbo. In fact, the Cayenne itself was 3 years away from going on sale when the ML55 showed up. This beat the BMW X5 M to market by a decade. Nobody was making high-performance luxury SUVs at the time. Basically, nobody was even making luxury SUVs yet, and Mercedes-Benz had already entered in the fast luxury SUV world with the ML55. And it's a big deal because now basically everyone has a performance version of their luxury SUV. And in fact, there are some luxury SUVs that are only performance versions, like the Lamborghini Urus, and Ferrari has one now. Even Acura has a performance version of their luxury SUV, and it all started right here. Prior to this, the only fast SUVs that had ever really existed were the GMC Typhoon, which isn't at all the same idea, and the Jeep Grand Cherokee 5.9 Limited, which really wasn't that fast. It was just a massive engine in an existing SUV. Mercedes-Benz really took the concept and kind of created it. And since we're talking about performance, we ought to start by discussing the powertrain. The ML55 used the same engine that was in a lot of other AMG models in the late 90s and early 2000s, a 5.4-liter naturally aspirated V8. Here, it made about 340 horsepower. All-wheel drive was standard, and it sent this vehicle from 0 to 60 in about 6.3-ish seconds, which isn't fast by modern standards, but back in the day, that was a really big deal. Other SUVs were doing 0 to 60 in the 8s, the 9s, this thing in the 6s, that was pretty quick. But the upgrades to the ML55 went beyond just a bigger engine. They did a comprehensive improvement to this car, starting with the hood, which has these two bulges coming out from either side. Now, these bulges are purely cosmetic. They're only there for show. They are not essential for the operation of the car. And in fact, you can't even see them underneath the hood. They are that unessential. But Mercedes-Benz added them to the 55 to make it seem more powerful, more exciting, and this is a true fact, to pay tribute to the 300 SL. The famous Mercedes Gullwing also had bulges like this, and that's why they did them on the ML55. That's something that came out of press briefings about this car 25 years ago when it was new. Other upgrades were more important. For one, you got bigger wheels. You can see these AMG-looking flat wheels. They're bigger than what you got in the regular ML, and you also had bigger brakes for better stopping power and red-painted calipers to emphasize the sportiness. Up front, you had a completely redesigned front bumper, which included fog lights that kind of gave it a sportier, more aggressive look. And on the side, you had flared fenders. They basically took the wheel arches that the regular ML had, and they made them a little bit bigger, a little bit wider to kind of give it a more aggressive look if you happen to notice them. In the back, you also had an upgraded rear bumper situation. It was a little more aggressive than what you got in the standard ML, not particularly noticeable, except for the fact that it has dual exhaust outlets, as you can see, one on each side to let that big old V8 breathe. Now, as for suspension upgrades, there actually weren't significant ones. Even though this was an AMG car with an AMG powertrain, it only got anti-roll bars to help control body roll and slightly stiffer suspension springs. Overall, the height of the car came down by about an inch compared to the standard ML, but that was it. You didn't have some completely new tricked sport suspension with adjustable settings. They just didn't do that. And I have a suspicion it's because Mercedes-Benz was a little anxious about going too far into the performance world with this vehicle. They didn't want to alienate buyers by making it too sporty and too stiff. Even if that meant handling would be a bit compromised for an AMG car, they just didn't want to take that risk. Remember, the Porsche Cayenne didn't exist. The Audi Q7 didn't exist yet. The BMW X5 had just come out, and with regular standard powertrains, they didn't know what the response would be to this vehicle, and so they decided to play it safe and give it more power, some styling upgrades, but not go too crazy in case people just didn't like it. It was kind of a risk to create this vehicle at all. And indeed, one other interesting exterior quirk is just how subtle it looks on the outside. It's not like a modern day AMG vehicle with widened everything and giant wheels and in-your-face upgrades all throughout. They kept it subtle and basic. Again, they didn't want to go too far and risk alienating potential buyers by making it all AMG-ified. It was a subtle upgrade over the ML, not quite the AMG-ness that we might expect today, but certainly the makings, the beginnings were there. However, while Mercedes did upgrades to the ML55 to make it more exciting than the regular model, the engine, the wheels, the brake suspension, basically nothing was done to the interior. It's actually pretty amazing when you get in here. It hasn't been AMG-ified at all. So radically different from modern AMG vehicles with plaques everywhere and distinctive trim and carbon fiber and seats and all this stuff. You didn't get any of that with the ML55. As far as I can tell, the only upgrades to this vehicle, the floor mats say ML55 AMG on them, which has to be the easiest thing in the world to change out compared to the standard model. You literally just pull them out and put in new ones. And then the gauges are white, and you can see the white face gauges. There's AMG printed right in the center of the speedometer in the middle. That's it. No other AMG, no badge on the passenger side of the dashboard, no headrest imprinted with the AMG logo. It was just a regular ML interior in here, except for those little upgrades. Again, I think Mercedes didn't want to go too far, making this sporty and carbon fibery and tight hugging bucket seats, because they were afraid people didn't want that in a luxury SUV and just wouldn't buy it. So a very interesting interior situation. Now, the other thing to mention about the ML interior from this era is it wasn't really that great. This was Mercedes-Benz era of expansion. They were trying new product lines, growing significantly, and they weren't quite as peerless in build quality as they once were. And so the interior in here has some pretty big panel gaps kind of all throughout. The materials are not the highest quality stuff like you maybe would have gotten in the late 80s, early 90s in a bunch of Mercedes-Benz models. It was a new frontier, sort of appealing to a more general buyer with this vehicle and various other Mercedes-Benz models in this era, like the A-Class. And so the quality wasn't quite on the level of some of the most first amazing Mercedes-Benz models from decades ago. Now, with that said, there are some interesting goodies in this interior, some surprisingly nice features that this car has. As an example, you go into the center control stack, you look all the way down at the bottom, and you see two switches marked 3 with a little window, one on the left and one on the right. Those switches will open up the window in the cargo area on either side to vent to allow for some air to come in. This is a feature that we typically associate with minivans from this era, but Mercedes-Benz put it on the ML. And again, the reason is they just didn't know what consumers would want. There were some SUVs in this era that had venting rear windows, and so they thought, let's give it a shot. Of course, this never caught on and never was really on any other SUVs, but Mercedes-Benz tried it here, which is pretty cool. Another good example of this situation comes, you can see this switch in the center marked low range. And yes, the original M-Class models had a low range gear, which is crazy to imagine now in a mid-sized luxury SUV with low range. But again, Mercedes didn't know what people were gonna want. It was one of the very first real luxury SUVs. There had been the Land Rover Discovery, the Range Rover, which had low range, and Mercedes thought, I guess we should include it in the M-Class too. Maybe people need it. Of course, it turned out that they didn't, but they tried it just in case. And more interesting quirks and nice features in here. For one, this little switch, very much hidden behind the steering wheel, that's your headlight washers. You press that and water would squirt out to wash the headlights, which was a neat little party trick you could show your neighbors in suburbia when you took home your new ML. Also, how about the fact that you had power folding mirrors? You can see right here in the center, the mirror control. There is a button to fold the mirrors in and a separate button to fold the mirrors back out. Instead of the same button just to switch one way or the other way, you have two distinctive buttons in here. Kind of interesting. And next up, another interesting quirk in this car. Under the passenger seat, you look down here and you can see there's like a little locking box. In fact, this is a drawer. You press the lock at the end and the drawer pops out and is actually surprisingly large. You can stick stuff in there that doesn't fit in the glove box or the center console storage area. A nice little added practicality in here. And here's another interesting practicality quirk, the cup holder situation in this car. One cup holder is to the right of the entire dashboard, the right of the glove box. You press this, it pops open, and then, well, you can store a drink in there over on the passenger side. Amazingly, the other cup holder is in the corresponding place on the driver's side. So that means to the left of the steering wheel, to the left of the turn signal stalk, that's where your other cup holder is. So instead of two center-mounted cup holders like every other car, they put them on exact opposite poles of the dashboard, including right next to the steering wheel, which I think is actually kind of nifty, kind of an interesting idea. And here's another interesting idea. The steering wheel adjustment was a lever that came off the steering column, just like in a lot of other vehicles, but when you would move the lever down, in other words, you would have the steering wheel in adjustment mode, a warning light would appear in the gauge cluster letting you know that you were adjusting the steering wheel. And then the moment you flip the lever back into lock mode, the warning light would go away. This is a crazy thing. Never seen this before, but I guess the idea was you didn't want to be accidentally driving around with the steering wheel unlocked. You go to make a turn and you push it down or pull it out or something crazy. And so that warning light lets you know when you're adjusting your own steering wheel. That's a pretty interesting one. And another interesting one is this little screen in the ceiling next to the rear view mirror. You can see it displays various pieces of vehicle information. They are all in metric, or like the European style of writing the dates. I'm sure I could change it, but this thing is kind of bizarre. One of the displays shows 6ER. I have no idea what that means. And another display simply shows the word no. So if you want to drive around with your car saying no from the ceiling, you can do that. Nonetheless, it is an information display that I suppose provides some information in addition to the word no. And next up, we move on to the back seat in the ML55, which actually is a pretty nice place to be. For one thing, it's surprisingly roomy. There's a decent amount of space for knees, legs, head. You get good seat space back here, which was kind of the point of this vehicle. The ML320, the original one, was supposed to be a family car, so it obviously needed family levels of room. But beyond just the space, it's pretty nice back here. You do have the power window switches in the center console, which feels kind of cheap. They're cheaping out not running to run the wires to the doors, which would obviously make more sense. But other than that, you do have some nice touches. A rear seat armrest back here is a nice feature. A lot of cars have that, but most cars integrate the cup holders into that armrest, meaning you have to choose between cup holders or a middle passenger. Not the case here. Instead, the cup holders come out of this panel in the center console, so you can have 3 across sitting back here and still use cup holders, which is pretty good thinking, especially from this era. You didn't see that too often. Also back here, you have 2 individual climate vents, as you can see, and even climate controls, which is a big surprise for the rear seat of a vehicle from this era, although the operation of the climate controls is absolutely bizarre. Over on the left side, you have your fan speed, and you can adjust it up or down, and this little light turns on around a half circle showing how fast the fan speed is going. Makes sense. The other side is temperature. You can also adjust it up or down, and you also have access to this little light showing you what you've selected, but it doesn't tell you the temperature. So it's just sort of like high or low, and you have to kind of use the light as sort of a guide to decide if you're too cool, too warm. You can push it higher. It's very strange not to have like a red-blue indicator at least showing cold, hot. Instead, it's just arrows and a little light. And finally, we move on to the cargo area of the ML55, where we discover one of this vehicle's most interesting quirks, which is the cargo area contains a full-size spare tire placed off to the side, which obviously creates some interesting consequences. But a full-size spare was really important to Mercedes-Benz when creating this vehicle. As already mentioned, they really didn't know what buyers would want, and the thought was utility was something people might want from a sport utility vehicle. Of course, that turned out not to be true. People just wanted the SUV to kind of show off and sit up higher, but they wanted to give the utility, and that means including low-range gearing and a full-size spare tire. In fact, there was an option on the original ML to have a rear-mounted spare tire, like an old-school Isuzu Trooper or Land Rover Discovery. That was a feature they offered, a rear spare tire carrier. But if you didn't get that, they still wanted to give you the full-size spare, and so they stuck it in the cargo area. Now, the result of that was, obviously, number one, it stole a lot of cargo space. You can see this spare tire sitting here means the entire cargo area shrinks by maybe 15% compared to how wide it could have been. And there are some other interesting consequences, too. My very favorite is the cargo cover. Unfortunately, this vehicle no longer has its original cargo cover, but you can see Mercedes-Benz actually mounted the cargo cover tracks on the spare tire case instead of the side of the vehicle where they normally would have, because the cargo cover had to come and cover the cargo even with the spare in place. You can also see the cargo tie-down hooks on the floor are kind of moved over a little bit to account for the fact that there was a spare tire sitting there. And they even gave you a storage net on the spare tire case, just like they would have done on the side of the vehicle, but there it was mounted on the tire because the tire was in there and they were going to have to figure out how to live with it, and so they did. A couple of other interesting things with the cargo area back here. For one, there is a power outlet back here, a cigarette lighter style 12-volt outlet. That is a big shock to me. It's surprising to see that in a vehicle from this era. You're not even seeing power outlets in the back of all new SUVs, let alone back here. Very nice, convenient feature to have. But those are your quirks and features of the ML55 AMG. Now it's time to get out and get behind the wheel of the original performance luxury SUV. All right, driving the ML55 AMG. And I gotta tell you, first and foremost about this vehicle, something I absolutely love is the powertrain. I love this engine. I had this engine in an E55 that I owned, a 2001 E55. And before the supercharged E55 models came out in the mid-2000s, there was a non-supercharged version with this engine. And the E55 had a little bit more power, and obviously it was a smaller car. And it really felt muscular and fun and quick. That was an eager powertrain. But the thing that I really liked about that engine was it was both reliable and it had a great, smooth, and potent power band. You could drop your foot and it would drop a gear and just smoothly accelerate very quickly through the rev range. It was a great powertrain. And the fact that it was durable and reliable was really great, proven by the fact that Mercedes-Benz then threw a supercharger on it, got 100 more horsepower, and that is still considered to be a reliable powertrain. It's just a really good engine in these cars, this non-supercharged NA AMG V8 from the late 90s and early 2000s. So I love this powertrain. And I gotta say, in this car, I love it too. A little less power than the E55, obviously a heftier car. It's still fun. It still feels eager. It is still a reliable powertrain. 136,000 miles on this car feels dead solid. Just such a good motor, and even a little bit of me dropping the throttle and you can feel it's just got great low-end torque. This engine is why people love V8s. Now, I will say, as much as I love this engine, I wish I could say exactly the same about the rest of this car, but the truth is, other than the powertrain, which again, excellent, the car really does feel like an early effort in something that became great later. And I've reviewed a few of these cars lately, actually. The original Escalade, the original Dodge Caravan, where they themselves are not great cars, but they kind of paved the way for greatness. And this vehicle is that. Powertrain's good, but steering and handling, the moment you start driving this car, you realize this is not an AMG in the way that you know AMG cars. Mercedes-Benz could have given this car sportier suspension, lowered the ride height, even bigger wheels than it had, like really kind of gone all out. But I think they were concerned that that would really hamper people's interest in the car because it would then be too sporty and too aggressive. And so they really didn't know how far people wanted to take this. Proven by the fact that they detuned the engine a little bit from the E55. They really weren't sure about giving it all the power, all the performance. They just wanted to make a sportier SUV, which they did. And it is sportier, but I will say that like steering and driving the car, I mentioned earlier that there are suspension upgrades, although they were minimal. I can't feel any at all. The steering is very light, not particularly commutative, not particularly precise, just not particularly sharp steering in this car. And it's the same story with handling. You pitch it into a curve and it's not exactly, you know, staying completely flat and upright. Now I will say it's flatter cornering than I would have expected given what I know about the original M-Class, how those drive, but it doesn't exactly corner super flat and the suspension is pretty floaty. Again, it's an effort, it's a beginning at something. From the perspective of the actual driving experience beyond the powertrain. You know, it's funny, the original M-Class is one of the most reliable models that Mercedes-Benz ever manufactured. The 3.2-liter six-cylinder engine that went into the ML320, the car is just tremendously reliable. However, the quality of the vehicle was not quite up to the standards of the quality of the drivetrain. And so this one has actually held up nicely. Everything in here is good, but you still have your rattles, you still have your squeaks, and of course the panel gaps and the general kind of design of the interior. It wasn't the highest quality era from Mercedes-Benz under any circumstances. It was fine, but they were really doing powertrains well in this era, and they had gone away from sort of the solidity that you could have expected even 5 or 8 years before this car. Nonetheless, as any GM owner will tell you, a reliable powertrain solves for a lot of issues. And so even though the design hasn't held up particularly well, and some of the interior stuff isn't that great, whatever, like it runs. And that's even true of the 55. You end up with a pretty quick, pretty rare, kind of cool looking SUV. Performs okay, performs pretty well, and it just will keep going because this is a great and reliable powertrain. And it's definitely not the athlete that later performance luxury SUVs became. There was no Porsche Cayenne. It was years away when this car came out, but it gives you a kind of a glimpse into, okay, let's give this a try, let's see where it goes. And of course, it has gone far from there. They just didn't know it back then, and they were trying. And it's interesting to see that attempt and to see what they did and kind of how this whole thing got started that has become a pretty popular world in cars. And so that's the Mercedes-Benz ML55 AMG. It may not have the aggressive look of all the modern performance luxury SUVs, and it's not particularly fast by modern standards, but it was there at the very beginning, and it's cool to check it out all these years later. And you can get this ML55 on Cars and Bids. Anyway, now it's time to give this Mercedes a DougScore. And the DougScore is here, 49 out of 100. The ML55 beats out the very limited class of performance SUVs of its day, the Dodge Durango Shelby SP360, the Saleen XP8, but it doesn't come close to later models like the original Porsche Cayenne or the Jeep Grand Cherokee SRT8. That makes sense because the ML55 really was a first effort, with soft suspension and not that much power. Greater performance came later. But this is still a neat vehicle that paved the way for some popular cars, and it was neat to review one.